So let's make a start then. But just before I start, I'm assuming that a lot of the audience is already familiar with Wardley mapping because we've had about 5 or 6 sessions on during the training week on it. So I'm not going to be introducing kind of the basics. What I will be doing is trying to apply some of these concepts to the development of security strategy and also on how to approach architecture in general. So this is what we will be covering today. So before going into Wardley mapping per se, I'm going to introduce the ideas on a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which I like to use before I introduce Wardley mapping as a way to, as a heuristic for us to understand if we're doing good strategy or bad strategy. Then we're going to be talking about the strategy cycle. I'm going to expand the use of Sun Tzu's 5 factors to cover cybersecurity. I'll first do that for strategy and then for what it means to architecture. Then I'm going to make a distinction between the role of the strategist and the role of the architect and how they need to be working together or coherently. Then we're going to talk about strategy development, the changing role of the architect. So in the last few years, there's been lots of changes in how organizations approach their development and their architectures. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about some climatic patterns that I believe are particularly relevant to security architecture. And then I'm going to show you a bunch of maps that I've created in the past and that others have created to show how we can use Wardley mapping in kind of as that you can use as templates, for instance, and that you can use to develop your strategy in your architecture. So there's a brilliant book that I would recommend everyone to read called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, The Difference and Why It Matters by Richard Rummelt. And we're going to be introducing what that is now. So a good strategy is straightforward, simple, and easy to understand, right? So we should not be making our strategy too complex because it will get difficult to get points across. And the more things we have there, the less focused we're being. So by definition, less strategic, because strategy is about focus. Also, the more we add things to our strategies, the more it will potentially be difficult to get traction from the internal people in which the execution of that strategy relies on, right? So if we're trying to do too much, people start losing focus and may start losing faith in what it is that you're trying to achieve. So in order to strategize, you need to identify the issues that are troubling your industry or your particular landscape. And this is where I think at a high level, the NIST framework, for instance, is good for this in that we've got the 5 things, so identify, protect, detect, respond, and recovery. But also to highlight the challenge even with NIST is that if you go 2 levels down of detail, you're already looking north of 600 things to consider, right? And this is where trying to do that many things is maybe good for architecture if that's what you need to do, but in terms of setting strategy is probably not the right level of abstraction, I would argue. So this is how Rummelt sees the difference between good strategy and bad strategy. So what he calls the good strategy, he calls it the kernel of strategy, which starts with the diagnosis. So in order to do a diagnosis, you need to understand your industry, you need to understand your internal capabilities, you need to understand your organizational challenges, you need to understand the resources that are available to you, and you need to understand what are the constraints, right? And with all of that, that's what you need to use to make an informed diagnosis of where you are currently, how things are operating, and if that is good or bad in your particular context. Then you need a guiding policy. This is not about our security policies. This is the guiding policy for the strategy. Okay. So after we make the diagnosis, we decide on what is going to be the guiding policy that will help us choose X over Y. Okay. And that will allow us 2 months down the line or 6 months down the line, when we're starting to drift away from our original strategy, that's the guiding policy that will allow us to recenter our resources and our focus, and what will allow us to make informed decisions if we should be spending money on this initiative or on that initiative. Right? Because we will always be facing competing objectives, right? That's the nature of strategy, which we'll talk about next. And things change with the context. So this is what will allow us to choose between what's preferred and what's essential, right? So that we as decision makers can focus on what's essential. And finally, it's about a set of coherent actions, right? Not scatterbrained, trying to do all the things at once. And that's a particular challenge, particularly for CISOs in large organizations, which may have budgets that can go everywhere from 5 to 500 million, depending on the company. But usually you may find yourself trying to do too much. And being strategic, it's about focus. So it means we should be focusing on resources where they can make a bigger difference, right? Also we need to be conscious that there's only so much security transformation that an organization can absorb without having significant impact to operations. Right? So issues with cognitive load, issues with attention, with other things that the business is also trying to do. Again, being strategic is about focusing. And then we have what he calls bad strategy. So bad strategy is about fluff and memes, right? So it's about looking at Gartner Magic Quadrants for your situational awareness instead of doing the hard work of understanding your current organization and how it works. It's choosing, for instance, a source transformation because that's a new thing that the analysts are saying that we should be focusing on. And I'm going to use an example from Simon Wardley to put this point across, which he usually says, when a general decides to bomb a hill, it's not because 78% of generals bomb hills, right? But because he or she understands the landscape and they understand that bombing that hill is a proximate objective on the way to achieve a bigger goal. And that's what he's after, right? He understands what the bigger goal is, and he understands that this proximate objective, the delivery of a new transformation or the adoption of a new practice, is something that will get them closer to achieving that goal, right? So it's not doing DevSecOps because everyone says it's the thing to do. It's not doing serverless everywhere because that's where the direction of travel and evolution is taking us, or using Jira for everything, even what it's not meant to be used for. It's thinking about your problems and coming up with solutions for them. What it is not is adopting buzzwords just for the sake of adopting buzzwords. Then it's also failure to face the challenge. In the problem preference bias plays a big role here for security leaders, which is particularly in how they set up their security programs. So you show me the background of a CISO or a security leader, and I can tell you 8 times out of 10 how they're going to approach particular problems, right? So the CISO that used to be technical or a developer will tend to use technology out of the way of most problems. The risk management CISO will try to risk manage his way or her way out of every problem. The business CISO will want to have a nice business priority conversations around everything. And these different leaders will approach problem solving in a particular way based on what they know and how they've usually approached problems. This is not something that only affects CISOs. This is human. This is, for those that know about cognitive sciences, etc., this is how humans work, right? But it obviously has an impact on security, and that's why I think we should discuss it. So having multiple perspectives in diverse teams is key on ensuring that we're applying the appropriate methods to the type of problem that we're facing. Knowing that all of the approaches above, right, can be potentially the right solutions for the problems we have, but they need to be understood in context. Another issue is mistaking goals for strategy. So in the past 5 years, I worked for a retail company where their mission and their vision statement was something like, we'll be the best in class, blah, 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 right? As we've seen a lot of mission and vision statements from security leaders. Well, we knew about a big amount of issues that they were facing, right? People leaving the company still having accounts after 6 months. No one was doing any patching, none of the time. There were a lot of big issues in the organization. So my question was, do you really think that's an objective available to you? I don't think it is. And that's even a bigger problem when you're pushing all of these visions and missions to the team that needs to believe in what it is that it's saying, because they'll be responsible for the parts of the execution of it. And the more you put on grandiose visions of goals, the more you run the risk of people not believing that they're actually attainable. So goals are nice, we should have goals, but they are not a strategy. They are different things. And the final one is bad strategic objectives. So this relates to the lack of situational awareness and not doing a proper diagnosis before setting the strategy. So you can find yourself spending time and resources on achieving objectives, and that will do little to improve your security posture, right? And this is abound in our industry, right? There's a lot of money being spent on security. Every year we see more billions being spent, and there's usually little being done to our security bottom lines, so the things that actually make our organizations more secure. So I think this is a really good framing before going into Wardley mapping itself, because even when I'm developing maps, etc., I like to keep these heuristics in mind, right? So that when I'm trying to come up with a strategy, I can come back to this list and think, okay, am I doing good strategy or am I doing bad strategy, right? And that's, I think it's a really good way to frame it, and what are the differences between them. So Wardley mapping is a tool for strategic intent, right? That supports you in your role as an OA, as a communicator, and as a leader. This is a definition by Ben Mosier. So it's a way to expose and visualize assumptions and mental models in a map format so that different people can discuss, iterate, and improve their current situation. Before we discuss the visual representation, at the core of Wardley mapping is the strategy cycle, which you can see here on the screen. So it combines the Sun Tzu's 5 factors and John Boyd's OODA loop. So observe, orient, decide, and act. I know that the representation seems to suggest otherwise, but this is iterative, not linear, right? Which unfortunately is not how most organizations approach strategy, which has largely been relegated into a once a year type of exercise before requesting budget, and then the rest of the time thought about being one of execution, right? That you think of your strategy in advance and then you execute on that strategy. And that's wrong. I don't think that's how people should be approaching strategy, because context changes. 12-month cycles is a long time. The way to be strategic is that you need to ensure that you get feedback loops and that you get constant situational awareness in your context, so that when things change, you are ready to change with it. Okay. And this also has two different but self-reinforcing whys. So we've got the why of purpose, why do we do what we do, and the why of movement. So why choose this option over that option? And that's what Wardley mapping is really good at letting us do. So when applying Sun Tzu's 5 factors to cybersecurity and development of strategy, this is how I like to associate them. Right? So purpose in business, it's about the moral imperative. So vulgarly and often referred to as the mission and vision statements that most organizations have. I'm not a particular fan of those. So when applying this to security, these are about our business drivers. So why do our organizations need security? What's in it for them? How are we making the business better off by having us or spending resources on what we're advising them to? The landscape in business, it's about the environment that we're competing in. So it includes the business supply chains, our staff, our competition, our customers, our value chains as well. So the way we instrument or we create our business processes, those are all parts of our landscape. In terms of security, I like to think of it in terms of the socio-technical context in which the organization operates. So not just people, process, and technologies, but over and above that, it's about the meanings, the competences, and the materials that we use for our security practices, and how they may or may not be integrated into coherent and effective units. Climate in business refers to the forces that are acting on the environment. Right? It's usually thought about as PESTLE, so political, economical, social, technological, environmental, and legal. In applying this to security, I see including all of those, but also about understanding the wider threat landscape as the forces that can impact our environments, our vendor and solutions ecosystems, yeah, and basically all those current and changing technologies and practices and patterns that we're using. Doctrine in business and military is about the training of forces in the standard modes of operating. So it's what and how we do things. So applying this to security, I leave it exactly as is, right? It's essentially about good management applied to the context that we're operating in. And finally, leadership in business is about gameplay. So we won't discuss gameplay in this talk today because gameplay from a Wardley mapping point of view is more specific to business, not so much to security, but I think there's room for exploring that further, which no one has, but maybe some point in the future. It's overall about the strategies that we choose, considering our purpose, our landscape, our climate, and our own capabilities to take advantage of them in the risks that they pose. Right. So it's about what do I have to deal with the battles that I'm facing now. Right. So applying to security, this is about our security program management. It's about our incident response and about our crisis management generally. Right. So this is how we apply leadership. Why we're choosing some investments over others, how we're making decisions across all spectrums. So from hiring to technology choices, to our team structures, to the separation of responsibilities for the security work, whether we try to keep everything within the security team, or we understand that other people can play bigger roles and we structure our teams and responsibilities accordingly. So all of those are about leadership. So when thinking about both the strategist and the architect, we should first understand the issue of temporal complexity. So this is in relation to Jay Bloom's that I've referenced his whole work, Sociotechnicity of DevOps talk here on the slide. And I've written also a blog post about this. Is that we need to understand the temporal complexity, what he calls the temporal complexity, which is whenever either a strategist or an architect, they make a decision, there's a duration of time where they will see the effect of that decision. Right? So each of them will have a certain scope for decision making. Yeah, and when we make there's a time lapse between when we make a decision and when we see if it actually worked or not. Right? And this is different for strategists and for architects. So for strategists, these can be easily in the 3 to 5 year time spans. For architects, and this depends on organizations, but it can be measured between months up to a year or a few years at most. Right? And understanding that these different temporal complexities is key to try and understand how these two figures can work better with each other. So this is how I like to also, relying on another talk by on the same talk by Jay Bloom, in that this is what he calls the time span of discretion. Right? So there's a complexity of decisions being made, and there's a scope of responsibility of the role making that decision. Right? So sometimes we have brilliant strategists that are great architects, and sometimes we've got brilliant architects who are also great strategists. But it's not often that you come across people that are great or brilliant at both, right? Because they typically require different types of skill sets. Not only skill sets, but the types of stories are also different. So the stories and the narratives in that they talk with their peers, right, the strategists and the architects, different types of stakeholders, they're going to have certain types of stories that they're comfortable with. So knowledge workers tend to be more comfortable in time spans of weeks or months, right? What I mean by that is they want to understand what they can do this sprint or next sprint to deal with the problem, because that's the type of stories they tell each other. While directors and executives, they're more comfortable with yearly or multi-yearly cycles, and the results and activities that each of these perform will provide them with feedback within their own time spans. Right? And this is also why an executive will be very bad at planning the sprint and as bad as a developer planning a 5-year strategy. Right? These are fundamentally different things that require different skill sets and require even different types of people, right? Because they're usually that different. So it's not just the type of narratives, it's likely they'll not even make sense of them, right? But in order to organizations to be effective at all of these different time spans, we need to find ways of connecting these narratives in order to provide a coherent approach to security. So strategists can use methods in frameworks like Wardley mapping and Cynefin framework for developing strategy and sense making. So I'll be doing a talk on Cynefin framework next week for the Open Security Summit as well. There are also important, but it's also important for architects to consider the emergent patterns which are being adopted, so we can consider the wider changes to the socio-technical context that we operate in, and so that we can be better prepared for changes in technology, social expectations, and evolving patterns of social practices within organizations. Okay, so for instance, one thing I'll get back to in a minute is there is today a bigger expectation of ownership and autonomy over security than there was 10 years ago by the people doing development and doing engineering, right? So a good organization, the organizations we perceive as being security unicorns, they usually have they put lots of ownership and autonomy on the hands of the people doing the work, right? As opposed to organizations still stuck in old command and control ways of doing things that may still try the empire building aspect of it and trying to centralize everything under the same governance and under the security or the CISO. So I think that connecting threat modeling with risk management with Wardley mapping at these different types of time spans is key to make this effective. So, but how can we go about the business of developing strategy, right? So I like to start, I've been doing consulting for a while now, and I usually have a few questions that start giving me a flavor of the type of environment that I'm dealing with. So these are some of the questions that I like to start with. So what's keeping senior stakeholders awake at night? So trying to understand what it is to them that security could potentially play a role in. So why does the company need security at all? So no one does security out of the goodness of their own hearts. There needs to be a business driver on why we need security. And that can be because of relationships with government, regulators, auditors, commercial organizations, can be relationships with media, with employees, with activist groups. So it will depend on context. Maybe we can start by currently identified risks, trying to understand what risks have already been identified that security can play a role in. So not just InfoSec risks, but actual business risks where security can potentially play a role in helping mitigate. How effective are our risk management practices? Do we understand the business critical success factors, and can we tie in security initiatives back to those business success factors? What is the people in technological transformation that is happening, and can we use that same transformation to add security into the way business processes are being re-engineered? And what are the business results in competition, right? So do we have lots of money available to us for transformation? Do we not? Are we spending kind of on par on security with other businesses in our industry, or are we overspending or underspending a lot? So those are all things that can help inform how we should be approaching the development of our strategy. So in all of this, we should be thinking about security framed as business enablement and not as deployment of controls. And I think that's still a big problem for security in most organizations, is that there's a tyranny of control, right? We over-focus on deploying more controls and not enough on what we can do as business enablers. So this was a map that I first developed solo, and then it was refined at the Open Security Summit in 2018. So this is what I call the map of security mapping, which is, for you that know about SAPSA, this is basically SAPSA on a map. And I usually use this map with when I start working with new customers to guide my initial assessment of new environments. So with this, I then get an artifact that I can use as guidance when first talking with senior managers or executives and think how evolved each of their practices are in each of the SAPSA layers, and gives me an overall visualization of where they are as an organization. Right? So I would still use some of the base templates from SABSA, but this allows me to build an artifact that gives me a view of the landscape, which is what maps are good for. So this position is my assessment of where the industry overall is. So the imperatives are still mostly around security as compliance, as opposed to security as enabler, and not enough on providing reasonable assurance against predictable threats, and mostly about following fads and in the latest buzzwords that Gartner puts out there. So most are very poor, so kind of stage one, at empowering customers and understanding the business attributes for security, and only marginally better at understanding the business context and adding value to the core products and services. So assurance and systems engineering are generally in a better shape, but most haven't realized that co-evolution of practices means that they need to start adapting to new ways of doing things, or they risk becoming inadequate, right? And that's something that we'll come back to later in this session as well. So another reference to Jay Bloom. So I have this really bad habit of relying on Jay Bloom's content, but he's okay with me referencing his work. So I really like his approach to Wardley mapping, which I haven't seen anyone else word it this way. So he likes to think at the top that we have a unique set of outputs and outcomes, which he makes a case to distinguish between them, right? So an outcome is what we aim to get from, right? So in this example, it's satiation, right? So we want to feel full. The output would be the bowl of cereal, which is what this particular map is about. Right? The things that are close, that we use, that are closer to the user, are a unique configuration of components for the niche, right? Which he calls a strategy. And these are the components in the map which are expected to provide strategic advantage, right? Then we have a common configuration of components, so what he calls a regime, in that we should be aiming to be as efficient as possible, as those aren't necessarily the things that are providing strategic advantage. And because not only because they are so far away from the user, so we know that we start with user needs at the top in Wordly Maps, and so you should be in the position to quickly or easily replace them. It should be part of how you design them, that they can be easily replaced without affecting your overall strategies, right? I hope that makes sense. So I've got, using, again, SABSA principles, this is how I think about it. And you'll see a few examples of how I use maps with business attributes at the top. But this is, so here we've got business attributes. I like to use them as the anchors. So this is what we aim to get. Examples of business attributes could be, automated, access controlled, vulnerability managed, hardened, whatever we feel is appropriate business attribute to use. And the outputs are the logical things that we create in order to provide us with particular outcomes. So I think of these as the security services that we provide to organizations, right? So not just what the security team does, but the security services that may be as part of the autonomy that in the agency that other teams in the organization have, right? So this is not just about the security team. And finally, we have a common configuration of components, so the regime. So the things we should be aiming to be as efficient as possible. So here, that's where we've got our controls, right? So our components, our tools, our standards, those things are part of components that we, again, a good strategy. If we're approaching the issue of holistically of strategy and architecture, I should be able to decide I'm not going to be an ISO 27001 house today and start using COBIT, and that having little to no impact on anything that I already have, right? That's not always the case. Sometimes things are way too coupled together in the way they approach processes and they approach technology, but a strategic approach that is well architected should allow for this to happen. And I think this type of approach on maps makes that a bit more obvious. So some of the key considerations for both the strategist and the architect. So we should ensure that we shorten and can receive and process the feedback as soon as possible. So obviously within different time spans that we looked at previously. as this implies that we're going to have the opportunity to intervene if we start seeing deviations from our expectations. Right? So this can have the form of managed key risk indicators for wider time spans, or even capturing outputs of threat modeling sessions or outputs of tools that we add to our CI/CD systems. Right? As an architect, so I like to normalize attributes to business language, as it's often the case that security people hide behind technical jargon that make what we try to do less intelligible to other stakeholders. So this also helps with communication. Think of clear separations between services. So what we provide to the business as security teams, or what other activities that the teams perform, from what are the mechanisms and the components that we use to enable that service. Right? Exactly to have this clear separation where we can mix and match or remove or replace components at the bottom layers, so that we can be more responsive to changes in our context. And finally, consider the implications to operational security. So from a strategist perspective, questions such as, are we detecting and protecting against the expected threats for the next decade? And what would be the consequences of not preparing now? And from an architect's perspective, do we have what we need now to deal with the current and immediate threat landscape? Right? And these are all things that should be, they're similar, but considerations that both the strategist and the architect should have. Now, about the changing role of the security architects. So an organization, so I'm not showing a map, but the role of the architect has been co-evolving with the new design patterns that have been emerging in the last few years. And I believe the book Team Topologies, which will have a session, I will do a joint session with Manuel Paes, one of the co-authors of Team Topologies, next Monday as well for the Open Security Summit. And I think this embodies the co-evolution of organizations, no longer being in the position to compromise between quality and speed, right? And this is mostly due to competitive pressure. So according to the Wikipedia, so socio-technical systems pertain to theory regarding the social aspects of people and society in technical aspects of organizational structure and processes. So it's not just the typical people, process, and technology we came to use in security, but how those interactions shape each other, right? In the book Team Topologies, they refer to this body of knowledge and also refer that a team behaves differently from a mere collection of individuals. And that's something that we generally miss in cybersecurity. We tend to think of how to target, we tend to think of how to do awareness, how to do all those processes, etc., targeting individuals and not teams or their interactions. And I think there's a lot we're missing as a result of that oversight. So the role of the architect is not merely to think about technologies and processes required to manage security. About 10 years ago, maybe you could get away with approaching it like that, but also is also evolving to include how this relates to the teams and the way teams interact with each other. And I think that's also something that the security architects need to pay attention to, because that's a change that is happening, whether we want it or not. And this is also from the Team Topologies book, in that they remind us of Conway's law. Right? So Conway's law says that organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. Right? I really like Ruth Mellon's corollary to this, which is, if the architecture of the system and the architecture of the organization are at odds, the architecture of the organization wins. Right? I think this is hugely significant for how we practice security and how we architect security. So I'm yet to have the privilege of working at an organization where there were really effective and mutually supportive communication channels between development, platform, and business teams, permitting a really holistic approach to security across everything from development to operations. And knowing Conway's law, until we fix those communication channels, we don't even have available to us some strategies which may rely or require that communication to be effective. Right? And when we are thinking about architecture, we need to start thinking about these. Right? It's not blindly trying to apply uncontextualized best practices. We really need to do more to understand the communication channels and how effective they are, because that will constrain the strategies and the architectures which are available to us. Right? And I think this is where the scope of architecture is moving to. So, introducing another useful frame to discussing this, the role of the architect is, I think that social practice theory provides a useful lens. So social practice theory breaks down the elements of practices into three. So we've got meanings, which are the symbolic meanings, ideas and aspirations. We have competences, which are about the skills, the know-how and techniques. And we have materials, which are all the things, technologies, artifacts, code, whatever. So those kind of things we can touch, generally speaking. So in understanding that they're not just interdependent, but they're actually mutually shaping. So we need, again, we need to be more strategic and more careful about how we approach each of these and how we relate them. So role of the architect is not just choosing the tech and standards, but helping design these shared meanings, these communication structures. And that's a pretty big job that most of us are not yet qualified to do, but that's what our organizations are starting to require from us. So my favorite example of evolved meaning of security practices is this quote from my business partner, Practical DevSecOps, Imran, that he says, in a DevOps world, a pen test is not for finding issues, it's to improve process. And I think in this quote really embodies the aspect of evolution of meanings, in that the competences and the materials used to perform pen tests haven't necessarily changed, but the meanings need to change if we are to integrate security and adapt them to our new development practices in the way people are now developing software in successful organizations. So if I could summarize in a key message what the role of the security architect is in 2020, in the understanding that he or she should be a boundary spanner between the typical gatekeeping teams, such as risk management and compliance, and the more technical oriented teams, which are hopefully making great products and services for our customers. So whatever architects do needs to have this tension in mind, right? And actively work to bridge the communication barriers between these. And that's why I'm done with trust but verify, right? That we still see a lot of old security people in security literature tout on a regular basis. As if they even knew what verification means in an on-prem environment. They usually don't, right? But as an industry, we really need to move away from using Soviet-originated slogans to try and do modern security, because that's not unlikely to be our best approach. So instead, I think that what a security architect needs to be rooted in enabling trust by the gatekeepers who need to come on a journey, and we need to help them make that journey, and informed agency by the teams who are doing the work. So the platform and the product teams, we really need to find ways of increasing their ownership in the agency that they have over their security outcomes, and what security looks like in their own practices. So again, this is largely a reference to SABSA. Those of you who know the SABSA matrix, you'll see this is what it is. So if previously we were talking about Sun Tzu 5 factors from the point of view of strategy, now this is my view of Sun Tzu's 5 factors with the lens of security architecture. So our purpose needs to be to fully understand and align with business goals, consider the different value chains or the business. So how does business actually happen? And you may or may not be surprised that most security teams don't really have a clue on how their business makes money, right? But their understanding is crucial, right? To have adequate security in the business processes, whatever those may be. And also needs to be considerate of overall business governance. In our climate, we should have an understanding, traceability and mapping to business attributes that we're aiming for. So I talked about a few: access controlled, hardened, those kinds of things. So you need to stop focusing on trying to avoid badness only and figure out how we can support business enablement. So the types of threats and risks that organizations are exposed to, in their current and expected immediate future. So those are all things that we need to consider in our climate. In terms of our landscape, it's about understanding our information and data assets, how we approach creating and actually practicing the management of risks. What are the human interfaces, but in not just systems, but actual team interactions, and all the components that we use to make our products and services more secure. All of these constitute our organizational landscape, which provides some affordances, so the things that allows us to do with it, and also serve as constraints to how we can approach security. In good strategy, in good architecture, always considers the affordances and the constraints in the environments that we're dealing with. And finally, it's the application of doctrine, which is we typically consider business and security operations. So that's where we need to live in day in and day out, and if it's going to be effective. I can't help but find interesting that Sun Tzu considered doctrine the least important part of leadership, but I have a feeling that that was because most generals just got it, and their training and natural abilities led them to doing it well. But in our current lack of overall situational awareness, so not just in security, but overall in business, with lots of fads and frameworks adopted as memes, I'd argue that this is the most critical part that leaders need to focus on before anything else. Also, regarding doctrine, so this is again reference to SABSA, in thinking small, as in knowing the details of why we're choosing and creating certain processes or adopting some technology, really knowing your users, both from the perspective of supporting organization goals, but also considering the developer and the engineering experience that our security is providing. And we need really to have a relentless focus on their needs, right? And SABSA is brilliant at this, as it allows us to anchor our security programs on business goals in business terms, and ensure that we can both justify and ensure the completeness of our approach. So SABSA is a modeling technique, so it takes a lot of time, but it's, in my opinion, it's worth the investment. And at that point, we can drill down from high-level goals to security goals, down to the level of services that are provided by the teams and the mechanisms that they're using. And with all of that, I particularly like to use this because if I'm talking to a developer, I'm usually talking about the things that are further down because that's what's relevant to them. If I'm talking with an executive, I'm talking about the things that are further up, right? And I'm still talking about the exact same things, let's say. It's just a different level of abstraction. And I can always refer back and use SABSA as a communication tool that allows me to talk security from top to bottom in any organization. So now we're going to talk about some climatic patterns that I think are particularly relevant to security architecture. So this is how we know that one of climatic patterns is that characteristics change as capabilities evolve, right? So something that is an internal prototype may have the potential for high future worth versus something that is high volume and low margin, right? Which is what happens with commodities. In terms of comparison, components begin with high degrees of instability, so they require continuous changes in development. At stage 3, they start being something that we acquire for particular features, right? And this is where most of our security products exist, where we choose vendor A over vendor B over one or two particular features that they offer. And at stage 4, something is seen as essential, right? It's seen as giving us an operational advantage. Right? So it's not necessarily about the features themselves, because they are, when they become commodities, we already understand its value. Right? So things such as static code analysis or dependency checking, we don't need to spend much time to convince people that they need to be doing this. Right? So that's starting to become a commoditized thing. In that we typically won't have boxes to manage and operate, we're just consuming services, right? So failure is expected in stage 1, but everyone's surprised by a failure of a commodity, right? So it's always news when a particular AWS zone or Azure zone goes down, right? And it's for that reason. And finally, on market action. So things in Genesis are usually driven by gut or gambling that a particular thing will evolve. In stage 2, the early adopters see the value where others still haven't. In stage 3, it's about market analysis and listening to customers. So think about Gartner reports, etc. So those play well in that type of field. And finally, stage 4, right, which is mostly about metrics and just building what's needed, right? No one's challenging or doubts the value or necessity of doing something. As most companies today, they no longer argue if you should be doing changing your systems to the cloud or not, right? It's becoming more self-evident. There are some other climatic patterns which I think are particularly relevant to security architecture. So no choice over evolution, which is also called the Red Queen hypothesis in biology. This pattern in a nutshell says that you need to constantly adapt in order to keep still, right, in terms of the relative position to others. So what it's also saying is that staying actually still will ensure your extinction, right, because we live in a competitive environment and that's what happens. A second order effect is that by adapting quicker, one can limit the growth of the competition by forcing them to continuously adapt by catching up and not pursuing strategic advantage. So I believe this pattern is currently very relevant to architecture in general, as new design patterns are emerging, such as the use of cloud-native technology and consumption of commoditized security tooling by cloud vendors and cloud-native foundation projects. And this is significantly changing how security is integrated and consumed in organizations. And also provides those adopting them with advantages both on cost and team topology, right? Because these things are being integrated into the actual, let's call it, fabric of how we do IT. It's helping put more agency in the hands of teams outside of the traditional security silos. Another pattern is inertia can kill an organization. So there are 3 patterns that relate to inertia. So success breeds inertia is one of them. So the more successful we've been with a particular component, the more resistance we'll have to changing it. A lot of people still have a big problem with distinguishing services from mechanisms and components, but that still happens a lot of security people holding on to old ways of doing things. An example I like to use is I'm not really sure why people would have a Cisco firewall or checkpoint firewall on the cloud, but yeah, that's one I'm not sure what the benefit they think they have when there are other patterns that they can use that maybe don't require those. You will probably notice that I don't have these days many friends in security product industry, but there are also other patterns relating to inertia. Is about the inertia can kill an organization, right? Which is in that for Blockbuster and Kodak, the problem wasn't really that they weren't innovating, it was that they suffered at the hands of their past business models. Right? And I think this is, again, particularly relevant to security, as the organization of security and responsibilities have been changing. In this ratio of 1 to 100 from developers to security professionals, we need to understand there is a constraint that we need to work around. Right? And finally, inertia increases the more successful the past model is. Right? So the way we did security in on-prem environments is fundamentally different from doing on-prem security. Some of the concepts still apply, but the form and the format they have is different. Right? And a lot of security professionals still have inertia onto adopting and advocating for these more modern design patterns. So, and finally here we've got creative destruction, which due to the combination of the Red Queen, inertia, and coevolution of practice, means that when we shift the boundary, particularly from product to commodities, we tend to see a rapid destruction of the old models. Right? So both business models and the practices associated with those business models are going to change. And there are going to be new ones coming. So the advent of DevOps and DevSecOps is a great example of that. And this is what market competition does. So specifically on more examples of creative destruction that I think is happening to the security industry. So if all you're bringing to the compliance table is writing abstract policies that technology people can't understand, managing things in spreadsheets and send over emails with endless list of requirements of all the security best practices that you can find out there, I think you need to know that the clock is ticking for that kind of work. So for instance, when I'm working with customers that I consult with, if they're hiring for compliance people right now, I tell them, go get a developer or a QA engineer that has an interest in security. Right? That's going to be someone that can create user stories, they can write scenario testings, they can even write compliance as code checks. Right? And that the teams can then integrate right off the bat and get immediate benefit of those shorter feedback loops. Yes, I need to teach him or her about how to manage audits, how to manage auditors, about the compliance frameworks themselves, but all of that is teachable, right? And if we find people with the right attitude. I'm much more unlikely to get a traditional compliance person to understand that they need to start learning how to speak in stories or learn how to code, as they're going to have significant inertia to that idea, because that's what will ultimately make them an extinct species. Feel free to disagree with me, but I'm going to stand by this one. Another aspect that we're seeing overall is the substitution of insecure frameworks for more secure substitutes. This isn't usually done necessarily as having security as the main driver, but a good example that I can give would be PHP. Right. So PHP, I think, is slowly dying, and we're seeing more adoption of something like React, for instance. Right. With that move alone, and because React escapes context by default, we eliminated cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. That's a whole family of vulnerabilities that a lot of people in the industry are still struggling with, that are mitigated just by adopting a better framework. Right? And over time, this will have massive effects on artifacts such as OWASP Top 10. We're not there yet, but that's kind of the direction of travel. The more, because we are seeing so many security problems across so many different organizations, the existence or the emergence of more secure frameworks are going to start to happen. And as architects, we need to understand what those frameworks are, so we can, as quickly as possible, start taking advantage of them. Right? Because that makes the job of security much simpler when we are using better frameworks. And another important aspect to creative destruction, which I'll expand on the next slide, is security products being replaced by consumption of commodities from cloud providers, or for the use of cloud native solutions as their offerings are maturing. So this is also a result of evolution, in that we will no longer be looking into the feature differentiation between different providers. So I'm not going to look at the firewall from Cisco and the firewall from Checkpoint and seeing which has the feature that I mostly require. These are now things that are becoming commodities, and we're going to get benefits, and we just expect them to work. Right. So dependency checking, vulnerability scanning, and static code analysis are all things that right now you can already start consuming them from Azure, from AWS, from GCP, and all of that, and that will only increase. Right. And this part in particular has an even bigger impact. Right. In so the talk that I'm giving next week on Wardley mapping on applying concepts, I'm going to talk about the management problem, and this is also part of what I call the management problem in security for the next decade. This also relates to not having a choice over evolution. Right? So product-driven bolt-ons are very CapEx heavy. In most organizations that, if you've been working for a long time in this, you will remember that usually on the budgeting cycle, we request big budgets, capital, so that we can then do our security transformation. Right? In many dinosaur companies, they still prefer this type of expenditure. And the OpEx is kind of generally a swear word. If you tell in these kind of old working organizations, if you tell them that you need OpEx to do a project, everyone will go crazy, and it's going to be very complicated to get OpEx. But it's usually a curse word even. forward-looking organizations, they appreciate the power that OPEX has as an enabling business constraint, because it forces everyone to be much more targeted on how they approach their development process and how they build value to their customers. If you worked in this for more than 5-10 years, you will probably remember that every time you wanted to make changes, you need to give a capex code, so then the finance people can refer it back to the building of a capital asset that is going to increase our balance sheet in the right columns, not the wrong ones, and all that stuff, right? But with this move, right, from product-driven bolt-on security components to the consumption of commodities, this is going to have a massive change to the CISO budgets, and they're going to be mutating as a result of this. Not only will CISOs have less unilateral decision-making for particular products or technology types, because also considering this in light of the evolving practices in organizations where more agency and autonomy is going on to the hands of engineers and developers, this is moving us from a capex heavy model to a medium opex model, where the consumption of security is going to be integrated into the CTO and CIO building, and not necessarily in the CISO will likely see his capital budget shrunk by a lot. Right. And again, we're going to see a lot of inertia in the market for this, because no one likes to have less money to play with and less autonomy on choosing the things they do with their money. Right. And there will be, I would imagine, lots of CISOs that will have a lot of inertia to this change. And that's why security companies will still be profiting out of this inertia from security leaders for at least another 10 to 20 years. Right. But those of us who are hopefully more forward-looking, that have maps to understand what direction of travel, hopefully I can convince you that this is the direction of travel, and that even though some of the cloud native or directly consumption of cloud commodities for security may not be at the same level of maturity as some of the product counterparts, they probably do the job, they probably do what it says on the tin, and you know that the way they develop their products is much quicker. They've got much less constraints, and they've got targeted teams just doing that bit of functionality. So you can expect a much more rapid development of those capabilities than you typically see with traditional security vendors. And I just made 10 more enemies. We have, sorry, let me just, okay, comment from Jason, that the implication of compliance as code is that standards are not measurable with automated checks, are going to be largely ineffective. I'm not sure I followed. Oh, okay, yes. So I think there will be a component of that. I think there are two aspects that we need to consider there. I think I can rely on, for instance, a compliance professional adopting compliance as code using InSpec, for instance. So the easy stuff, maybe we can, it's relatively simple to create checks that we can use InSpec in order to do that. So for instance, everything on phase one, not phase one, maturity level 1 of ASVS, they should be relatively simple to do with something like InSpec. For other things that are more complex, maybe we really need someone that is a good QA engineer that knows how to perform really extensive and more complicated tests, right? But most of them, I would expect that at least 80 to 90% of things that could be in some way checked as code, right? Not stuff like even threat modeling once people start doing it as code, right? So we're getting to a world of immutability, and that's actually what I'm going to be talking about next, to having most of what we do in a declarative manner, so on GitHub, version controlled and all of that. So more and more, we're going to be able to actually be in the position to check things as code. That would be my thoughts on that. So with regards to inertia due to success of past model, So we're still too hung up on CIAs, right? So the typical confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So I'm not arguing that we should dismiss them. We shouldn't. But I am arguing that as design principles, we should be adopting ones that are more suited to be absorbed and consumed by the current design patterns that are becoming the best practices. Right? In those patterns, they are providing unprecedented levels of resilience when compared to our old on-prem models into how we came up with CIA to begin with. Right? So this refers to the work of Sonil Yu. There's a link at the bottom on his slides, and also a brilliant talk that a webinar that it gives on this subject that I would advise everyone to look into. So if we're building distributed architectures, should we really be thinking about the availability of single systems? Maybe not. If we have declarative definitions of the elements across all our applications in the infrastructure, do we really need to be thinking about integrity monitoring systems or other integrity mechanisms? Instead, would we not be better thinking about how we can leverage immutability to prove and comply with our integrity requirements? And finally, if we're designing for ephemerality, right, so making systems short-lived for orchestration, for instance, and even adopting serverless architectures, so, and with that, making attacker persistence incredibly challenging, should we be spending too much effort on assuring confidentiality? Okay, I'm going to go further on this one. So if we've engineered systems with an average lifetime of 10 or 15 minutes, should we be spending 15 or 20 minutes on the CI/CD, checking the security on CI/CD pipeline? Right? So basic economics would suggest that we probably shouldn't, right? And that maybe some lightweight hardening and dependency checking would be more than enough, right? So we really need to, there is something that like the Netflixes and the Facebooks, they are getting right. They understand how these principles of resilience engineering, etc., can help support different way of doing security. But largely, I think the InfoSec industry is still far behind. And in terms of, and I think we will do very, very well in starting to adopt these new words, right, as the design drivers for how we're approaching our security problems. So this change in lens isn't groundbreaking, but I think that changing our language is a required step to change our worldviews and adopt new mental models. And whilst we keep on talking about CIA like we've been doing for the past 20 years, it's unlikely that the people that need to change their worldviews will change them if we also don't make an effort to change their language. Right? In this, I think, makes it also much easier to have conversations between engineers in security. So just quickly on this one. So this is the story of co-evolution of computing, right? So first we had IBM building in the late 50s, the 701, in early 50s, the 701, and that was the early days of custom building. So it wasn't until the 80s that we had personal computing and adoption of computing for more use cases, right? In the 90s, lots of companies started building their own data centers and offering data center services and offerings like colos and things like that, right? So in this type of environment, we had a very high mean time to recovery. So if we needed more compute power, we usually needed to procure hardware, wait 6 to 9 months for it to arrive. We needed to rack it, we needed to network it, we needed to install operating systems, and then we could actually have do something useful with it, right? And so that's why patterns such as N+1 for withstanding failure in development practices like waterfall reflected those long wait times in that cadence. Right? Even when we started having virtualization, there were really no significant changes to the underlying practices. So we're still using these things because, in going back to social practice theory, so the meanings, the components, the meanings, the overall practices, they were all kind of together and they were coherent with these long wait times, this mean time to recovery, right? But then cloud computing came along and we no longer had to wait months for hardware to arrive in setup. So that led to the emergence of new practices and new design patterns. So we could now scale out, we could have more standardized approaches to repeat patterns at the infrastructure level. And that's how DevOps movement emerged. right? So the diehards in security and engineering had, in some still have, inertia. For many years, people have been called idiots, irresponsible, or negligent for wanting this type of speed into delivering things. But eventually it became to be agreed as a general best practice, right? And then as this matured, containerization and orchestration started emerging, and then new patterns also started developing around that are considered now best practices. And now we've got DevSecOps that are referring to securities environments with lots of good practices also becoming to be more generally accepted. But now, and this is kind of where we are at the moment, right? But we are also seeing the adoption of serverless frameworks. Right? They're coming along, and again, everything is going to change. Right? Practices, some of the practices associated are still in Genesis, in custom built, but through the forces of supply and demand, and once we get over some technical challenges, such as kind of the wait time to kick off a function and things like that, there are still some challenges to some architectures, but as with everything, those challenges will be overcome. Because that's how evolution happens, and lots of new capabilities will be made possible by this shift. Because we're talking about metered consumption of capabilities, there will no longer be a sunk cost situation to code refactoring. And I think that is going to be the biggest change to secure. What is going to do more for security is this, the end of this sunk cost problem. Because in a world of serverless, so not just functions as a service, but full serverless architectures, there's full visibility of cost. And every time we refactor code, we are going to immediately see the savings on our monthly expenditure. Right? So right now, the CFO is usually in the position where he needs to decide between doing a marketing campaign or code refactoring, right? Because he only has X amount of money and he needs to make the best decision for the organization with it. In a serverless world, that's no longer the case, right? Because the CFO will suddenly have more interest in the quality of the code being produced, because it will no longer be just a CTO or CIO problem, right? Because he will actually be in the position to do the code refactoring so he can afford the marketing campaign. Right, and that's going to be unprecedented. That's not how it works right now. So the bad code developed will cost you 20p per transaction, whilst the good, clean, and probably highly secure code will cost 2p per transaction. So code quality will start to become an issue very, very quickly in a serverless world. And this is also going to likely lead to the emergence of markets for functions. Right? So even to deal with security. So something that takes a standard input, does a specific transformation, and generates a standard output. So this, if we go back to the J. Bloom's definition of what is a strategy and what is a regime, right? That's where this type of lens is going to be hugely important, where companies, the code that is providing strategic advantage, you will obviously want to keep it to yourself because that's just about strategy. But the things that you use as regimes, those, and if you do them well, those are things that you can actually resell on the market and further monetize them, right? If they're not giving you particular strategic advantage. And that is going to lead to much better code as the ecosystem and the forces of competition start working. So the main point of this slide is that as activities and components evolve, the practices that are associated with them will also co-evolve. And that's not a bad thing, but it doesn't mean that we need to get better at fighting inertia, right? Because these new development practices will emerge, and we, if we want to be in a better position to support our businesses, we need to start thinking how we can take advantage of them. So here we're going to now start using, looking at some use cases in the context of strategy and architecture. So this is just the typical way of looking at using appropriate methods. So things when we're first developing that are in stage 1 or 2, we should build them with agile methods and build them in-house because we should have a focus on reducing the cost of change. Things that are more productized, that we want to acquire for specific capabilities, we should focus on learning and reducing waste, indeed use lean or buy them off the shelf, because that's usually more better solution for that space. And finally, for things that are in stage 4 that require focus on reducing deviation, then Six Sigma or outsourcing appropriate methods. This is an example, a security example on how to use a Wardley map to make these kinds of decisions. So the things that are further to the left, these are things that we should be doing in-house. So things such as automated control monitoring, threat intelligence, incident management, those are things that we would do well to build in-house. Everything that is further to the right, let's not spend time doing it ourselves because others do them better and cheaper, and let's either outsource or get external providers to provide them for us. Right? So after we map our value chains in security, we can then use the maps to ensure that we're applying the appropriate methods depending on its level of evolution. This is an example of visualizing the landscape, so particularly on antivirus. So here I use different sized circles to portray the size of the estate, and also use the line of good to be a compliance line. So I did this map specifically for Cyber Essentials example. So what so in this map, we've got two items, also two items that have special meaning in Wardley maps. So one of them is the black bar, which represents inertia, and the other one are the red lines, which represent lines of future, and used to represent the movement that we are considering. So in this instance, we've got more than one movement being considered. So here I mapped this different estates, so host OSs, to different AV products. And then here we have a Trend Micro, which is on-prem product. We've got a new McAfee SaaS service offering that is more commodity, in an aged Sophos deployment that is only supporting some legacy Windows XP. So the reason why I've put XP in Sophos in stage 2, it's because it is so outdated that it no longer has the characteristics of stage 3 or 4. Right? So when things start getting really old, we can no longer treat them as we once did, right? Because they stop being supported, they start having all those characteristics of things in stage 3 or 4. And I've also added a consideration for knowledge within the teams. So as McAfee is something that was relatively new, people still haven't built the internal expertise to manage it. And the Trend Micro has been used for ages, so everyone in the team knows how to use it. So with this map, we can start considering some of our options, right? So, for instance, if we decide to do on Trend Micro, we are also deciding that we're going to have this capex heavy type of investment. We're going to be having to manage patching and managing all those things that you do on managing on-prem products. If we go to McAfee, all of that goes away. You're just consuming a service, so it's going to be an OPEX heavy type approach, but you won't have the CAPEX expenditure. You will less likely to have as many conversations with the vendor because by definition it's more stable, it will require less changes. But in this particular case, you also know your teams that's what this map is trying to tell us. You are not yet in the position where everyone knows your team doesn't know how to really manage the product. So if you choose that the right strategic solution is for everyone to go to McAfee, then you need to also ensure that you put in an initiative to get everyone to a better level of understanding of how it works. And this is visualizing your AV landscape, for instance. This is so about option analysis. So this is an example of using a map with a subset structure. In that at the top, I've got a business attribute, in this case, automated. Then I have some services that are supporting this objective of being automated. So it's both automated testing and secure provisioning. And then we've got some mechanisms. To do secure provisioning, I need an automation framework. To do automated testing, I need one of the things I need is compliance as code, right? So the components that enable them is Ansible and Ansible remediation roles for the automation framework. And then for inspec to do my compliance as code. And in this map in particular, we should assume for the purposes of this map that we're not yet doing dynamic analysis. That's something that we're now exploring. And then we've got, so in terms of the practice, it's non-existent, so it's Genesis. And in terms of the technology components that we're considering, I've got 5 things here on the map. That this is obviously opinion, and you should discuss maps within your own teams to see if everyone agrees on placement. But on one hand, I've got Azure Vulnerability Management, so it uses Qualys as the underlying scanner that you can potentially use. Also, you can have Qualys as kind of on-prem or installed product in your cloud environment, or something like probe.li to do that for you. Or you can decide you're going to use WASP-ZAP or Nikto as open source products to do that work, right? Or you can decide you shouldn't to develop your own in-house solution to do that, right? But with all of these solutions that you are considering put on a map, then you can have conversations with your peers and with the people in the organization to see what's the best fit for your particular context. Usually, going back to Wardley lingo, if you really, really need a particular feature that one of the vendor provides you with, then you should be going for a product. If you don't have a very good reason why you should be going for a particular differentiated feature, then you should just adopt a commodity. But that's kind of my rule of thumb when I'm assessing the evolution of vendors. Another thing you can use them for is for duplication and bias. So particularly, but not only useful for group type settings. So when you've got lots of markets or business units to help you make sense of it. And we can aggregate data from multiple maps and activities that we have available and see how some people are treating something as opposed to other people treating the same thing, and allows you to spot duplication and opportunities for consolidation. So this doesn't mean that people custom building or buying products for what's available as commodities are wrong, but it's a valid challenge to make to that particular stakeholder who's insisting on one or the other on why is it that they can't adopt a more commoditized version of that. So I was asked a question before we started recording, which I mentioned I was going to show an example of how to potentially use Wardley mapping across a group setting. So this is the example that I was referring to. So if you have multiple markets or multiple business units, so using the same example as before, so I've got a service, automated testing, different mechanisms, so compliance as code and dynamic analysis, and I can try and put on a map not only what is the evolution of the technological component itself, but also how evolved is the service management part of it, so the actual practice and how people are doing it, and then use a single map to overlay this information from multiple markets, multiple business units, so it gives me a better view of the landscape. In this one, I also added a consideration for who has ownership for this particular component or for the particular service. Right? So in this example, we have a few that are in the hands of devs, other ones are in the hands of a security engineering function, and others still on the hands of compliance. Right? And with this kind of overall view of the landscape, we can then start starting to make sense of what options we have available. Right? So it may be that, for instance, using this example, WASP-ZAP may be a product that is not very as mature, as evolved as the other ones in use, but it's actually where its practice is most evolved across the group. So maybe instead of trying to consolidate a group setting, if that's what I want to do, and not give people the autonomy to choose their tools, if I have to do a consolidation, it's a trade-off that I'm going to have to consider, right? If I want to go to a less evolved component with a more evolved practice where these people can potentially do knowledge sharing and we can ramp up the practice quickly because we've got someone internally that can provide that training, or go for a more evolved component that we have less of an understanding of how to actually manage, that will in both have pros and cons, right? The map is not there to tell you what to do. The map is there to put all those things on a map so you can have meaningful conversations over them. And finally, we can also use maps to, I think this is, the maps to look at skills and emergent practices in security. So the commoditized skills are the traditional approaches to compliance. So spreadsheets, box ticking, those kinds of things. And on-prem compute with the product-driven security. There's little strategic advantage, both to the individuals and the organizations they're part of, in having these skills, right? As they're commoditized. Anyone can do it, and it's easy to train people on doing this because there's a lot of information out there. So what the market is currently asking for, so what I have in blue here, is still valuing, but it's becoming more and more commoditized, is an understanding of AppSec, understanding of how to do continuous integration and continuous deployment in threat modeling, in proper understanding of what cloud is, right? So not how to lift and shift on-prem systems to the cloud, but on actually making good use of cloud services. And also, personally, I've mostly been learning and blogging about things in yellow. So everything, stuff on the left. So the market isn't fully formed for a lot of them, but it's making the customers that I wish to work for find me. In a few years' time, as the market starts catching up, I want to be positioned as one of the people that's been talking about this for a long time and build my own expertise and body of knowledge that I can refer back to. So activities such as use of cloud native technologies, DevSecOps, threat modeling as code, compliance as code, quantitative risk management like FAIR, so factor analysis of information risks, as opposed to qualitative risk management as most organizations still approach it. Things such as writing security requirements as stories or scenarios or even tests, which software needs to pass. And furthermore, practices around resilience engineering, privacy preserving techniques, and also aspects of safety engineering. They're all becoming more commonplace. So companies like the Netflixes and Facebooks use a lot of these things, but they're not yet commoditized. They're not yet they're probably in stage 1 or 2. Right? So these are the patterns that are emerging. We're already seeing some of the big players and the people that are more forward-looking adopt some of these, but they're still not out there. Right? And this is as architects and as strategists, we should be looking at how far away are we from being in the position to adopt these, and could we have any strategic advantage by being early adopters of these, right? Again, the map is not telling you that you should immediately jump on these bandwagons and do these things. It's telling you these are emerging, and you need to understand internally, either if you have the context, the constraints and the affordances to make these happen in your environment, or better yet, see what it is that is preventing you right now from adopting this, and over the next few years do the work so that it's actually an affordable, it's actually a strategy you can pursue in a few years' time. Because as with most of these things, at some point it will become existential. But so knowing what's coming next is key, and that's what Wardley maps allow us to do as well. So with this map, you can use it for a couple of different things. Inform your own development, right? Identify the types of skills you're hiring for, or to ensure you're acquiring the skills that you're going to need in the future, and also create development plans for your organization or transformation plans. So one last example is with regards to doctrine. So we won't go into any details on each of them, but looking at our organizations, we should be able to assess ourselves against each of the different patterns to get a view of how well we're currently managing and supporting continuous learning and growth in the organization. So for each, we need to ask ourselves and our teams, So we should not rely on our own cognitive biases. If you're doing doctrine assessment on your own, you're going to get it wrong. A lot that you don't see, and if you don't do this in conjunction with other people, it ends up being mostly meaningless. But in a team setting and with stakeholders, you should ask the questions of what types of methods and forms do these take in my context? Am I doing them well? Am I not doing them at all? How disparate are the opinions of team members on the same patterns? And what does that tell me? Right? Security specific doctrine. There is not something that that exists that I've seen developed. It's something that I've been thinking about, but where I am at the moment in considering that is that I think it would be more beneficial first exploring how to apply these in a security context for a security team, other than trying to come up with new patterns. Right? But there is definitely something that is also another thing that is underexplored at the moment that I'd be happy to collaborate with people to try and do something about it. So there are a lot of things in here that that we can really focus on. And now some closing thoughts. So let's wrap up. Why should we Wardley map? So the first reason is due to the great conversations that we can have with peers and teams during the creation of the map. So what is the value chain? What needs do we have? And can we agree those are the right needs? Or do we have a bias towards a particular component or a particular activity? Right? I've always had wonderful conversations around maps, as opposed to dumping of my own narratives and what I think is right. In building a map invites participation from those looking at it. It also provides a shared vocabulary and patterns in business. Right? So one of the great things to do is that this gives us business language that we can use talking with technology and business peers. Right? It really fast tracks the acquisition of this type of shared vocabulary, so they can be better communicators and better frame our security advice on climatic patterns which are going to affect business. It also forces one to expose our assumptions and biases. And again, it invites challenge by others. So if you don't like to be challenged, you should probably avoid Wardley mapping. So in these then become visible to others. So the landscape, climate, and doctrine, they all have patterns that we can learn and we can discuss with others on what effect they're going to have on our landscape and strategy. And most of all, it helps to depersonalize the challenge when having conversations with teams and stakeholders. So you're challenging the map, not necessarily the person building the map directly. So it may look like and sound like a subtle difference, but it is very beneficial and important. Right? It may be uncomfortable, but that's just how it is. You obviously have to be willing to listen and be challenged, and it needs to be psychologically safe to do so. Right? And that's why we've got doctrine, and because doctrine helps us create an environment where people are free to challenge and feel psychologically safe in doing so. So there are two ways that you can use Wardley maps. You can do the built-in bin, so use it as a communication tool and then throw it in the bin, or even not use the artifact at all. So I use Wardley mapping every single day, but I rarely do lots of maps. So I do Wardley mapping because I use words and the vocabulary of Wardley mapping to talk with my stakeholders, right? Not because I'm building all these artifacts that then I can keep them. Or you can also build and maintain. So if you can adopt mapping as the Wardley map as an artifact that you can build and maintain within your team, then brilliant, right? And you can use that as a continuous evolving as you make new decisions, as you challenge the things that already exist. So tools that I use to make Wardley maps. So I still haven't I use multiple, so I haven't used a single one. I like to use Miro.com because it has some templates to the Wardley mapping, and you can use post-it notes. I also use a lot of the examples that you've seen here, examples that I've done with Google Slides, which is not particularly good if you're trying to kind of scale. I've been using lately either onlinewordlymaps.com or mapscript.org to do it programmatically. So if I want to share code with someone, I would do it like that. And finally, I sometimes use what's the other one? I can't remember the other one. I think there are about 5 that I tend to use. But either kind of a slides thing, Miro, when I want to do something really quick, or that I'm doing as part of a wider assessment. So, for instance, one of the things that I'm currently doing is I'm trying to map the cybersecurity strategy from the Chinese government. That's being a really cool exercise that I'm doing. For those types of things, I like to use Miro, because what I do is I put in the pages of the PDFs and I paste them as links in Miro, and then I just start building chains right alongside it as I go reading the text, and that allows me at the end to try and consolidate onto a single map, right? So it depends on how I'm building the map, but there are some good tools out there. So the key benefits for security architecture is to see and discuss a landscape, to assess evolution in context and anticipate change. The more we can foresee the future, the easier it would be to prepare for it. And also because on doctrine, right? So that we can learn about patterns for effective management. As many of us will probably know, not every security leader has any type of management or business background or understanding of management practices overall. That's something that a lot of security people evolve through the ranks through other means, and that doesn't necessarily make them good people managers, right? So I think Wordly mapping can help us also bridge that gap, right? In terms of how we approach people management and in culture within organizations, which may not be our strong suit. So I think Wordly mapping is a great companion and supplement to security architecture, and it's also a brilliant tool to help us develop an appropriate strategy, right? It gives us the tools and the vocabulary to collaborate and to do all of these hopefully wonderful things on developing security strategies and security architectures. And that is me. Thank you very much, everyone. Do we have any questions now?
Thank you so much, Mario. That was a great session. Any questions, everyone?
Hello, Mario.
Yep.
Yeah, hello, Mario. Can you share? Can you once again open the slide of emergency? The slide of emergency skill?
Sorry, there's a bit of background noise. I'm not sure I'm understanding which slide you're referring to.
Just I kept a message on a chart. Can you look into that?
Look into what? Sorry. Emergency skills. Yeah, emergent skills.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Next slide of emergency.
Yep. This one.
Yeah. Next slide. Next slide.
This one.
No. Yeah.
Hello.
Can you explain once again on this?
Could you ask again? Sorry, the connection is breaking up, so I didn't fully hear the question. Hello? Is it my internet or someone else's?
No, it's his internet. He's breaking off.
Yeah, could you write the question? Sorry.
Have you answered Avi Dagun's questions?
This one or the emergent skills?
Hello, Uday. What slide is it that you want Mario to explain again? It's not getting it, Joe.
Yeah, I'm having some network issue. Sorry. Can you explain me the next slide of emergency skills? Next slide.
Versions. Yeah. So this is basically what I did was I went to look into job descriptions, and I also did an assessment of the companies that are renowned for doing good security, such as Netflix, Shopify. So I went to see some of those kind of companies that we usually consider them to be some kind of security unicorn, and see their blogs in their job descriptions on the types of things that they mention when they talk about security. So here we've got a bit what I call the commoditized skills, right? So the things that people in the industry already, there's a lot of people with this type of skill in the industry. Right? So both to organizations and to the individuals themselves, it is no longer providing them with any strategic advantage. Right? So what I mean by that is if I have a lot of the skills on the left and I'm going applying for a role where there's a candidate who is mostly has skills that are more to the right, I am likely to be in a better position to be considered for that role. Right, because I'm bringing things to the table that the other there are not commodities in the market, right? You don't just find anyone that has those skills. Right? So that's what I'm calling because they're commoditized. They are becoming legacy skills. Right? The things in the middle were more again looking at job descriptions, etc., and more companies that looking at job descriptions, things that companies are looking for. Right. So the colors don't have any particular meaning. I just wanted to make sure that I was there was basically differentiating between what are legacy skills. So the legacy skills are in purple. What the industry is currently asking for, I've put more in blue. In the orange ones are the emergent things that are starting to be asked for by the market. So it was just a way to differentiate between legacy, what the industry is currently asking for, and the emergent skills. But, in those, the things in blue are more the things that the market is currently valuing a lot and paying big money for. So things such as AppSec, proper threat modeling, and the understanding of continuous integration and continuous deployment. These are things that if you know how to do right now, you should be in high demand from the security industry. Right? Then to the left are things that the market, most of the market is still not asking for, but the organizations that we came to consider security unicorns, they do a lot of these things already, right? So, and because of the nature of markets, right, supply and demand competition, these are being seen as some of the emergent practices and the emergent skills that are going to be required by more organizations in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. So the idea being that these things that are on the left, in 20 years, they are probably going to be the new legacy skills, right? Because everything evolves. Does that make sense?
Yes, and he is asking like explaining the next slide also.
Yep. So this one, yeah. So this is the overall list of doctrine, right? So this is an example that Simon Wardley uses a lot on some work he did with a government agency. But in that, these are the 5 different kind of themes within doctrine, which is categories, which is communication, development, operation, structure, learning, and leading. Yeah, and this is basically what the whole of doctrine looks like. And the suggestion on how to use doctrine is that you should identify how well you are doing each of these things. So do you have in your team or your organization transparency? Do you focus on high situational awareness? Do you use a common language, which is necessary for collaboration? Do you have a method to challenge assumptions? So can people speak up and question and feel psychologically safe by doing so? So those are the kinds of things that that doctrine is about. So the talk that I'm giving on Wardley mapping next week is going to focus on a lot of these things with actual methods that we can apply in security for these, right? So that's kind of my initial, and actually going back to the question Avi was talking about, that's my kind of initial exploration on how to not to apply, not to come up with new doctrine, but on what methods that we already have in the security industry that map to some of these doctrine. Okay, so for instance, just an example on the subject of using a common language. Next week, I'm going to talk about 3 methods that we can use to adopt common language. One of them is adoption of SABSA, right? That gives you that common language. The other one is on using cybersecurity style guide by Bishop Fox to normalize the language that we're using, even between security teams. And the third one is something that I'm not remembering off the top of my head right now, but I talk about 3 things that that we can do to use common language in organizations.
All right, so there's another question from Louise. Have you seen that? He is asking about what did the colors mean in the graph?
I responded to that as well.
Okay, all right, perfect. Anything else?
I'm just curious, like the model you present is so refreshing and radically different than the way that I've seen InfoSec. And I wonder if you have any insights into like why InfoSec has so many common bad patterns. Like, is it the lack of the right mental models? Is it the wrong incentives? Is it all the above, you know, all these things? What do you think is behind it?
Very good question. So I think all of the above play a role, and that's one of the things that I most love about Wardley mapping, is the idea of coevolution of practices. Right? The problem we have, I think, generally in the security industry is that we haven't really overall, right? We haven't really changed our ways from how we did security 20 years ago, from how we do it now. Right? Some of the same classes of vulnerabilities are still the same, right? We haven't evolved much, right? And the problem with that is it's not just a security problem though, right? You still see hundreds of companies that are calling it agile and DevOps, but then have 100 gates throughout the process, right? They're just wanting to adopt the meme because it's the fad that they know they need to get onto, but they don't actually want to change the way they do things because it's comfortable and they know how to do it that way. Right. So I don't think this is a particularly security problem, but it is a gatekeeping problem. Right. So if you go have a word with the typical areas of the organization that have been gatekeeping for the last 20 to 30 years, so I'm talking finance, I'm talking procurement, I'm talking service management. So those things that we're used to, now everyone stops. I'm going to take my time to look at the thing properly, and then I'll tell you if I'll let you do that. Right? I think it's the gatekeeping problem, which also affects InfoSec. That is the big problem. And what we're learning with these kind of emergent patterns is that the way we organize the work in organizations, the way we do team structures is radically changing, right? And we actually learn in the companies that are successful are learning that the more they increase the agency and ownership of the doers, the more they are being flexible in we don't need someone to be checking on their shoulder to do a good job, right? No developer writes insecure code because they want to write insecure code, right? They may write insecure code because they don't have the telemetry and they don't necessarily know better, right? And that's the main shift that I think we that we need to fight is not only does InfoSec generally as a standard practice not have the skills to help people understand what it means in their context, right? So we know how to write policies, but we can't actually tell an engineer what it means to them a lot of the times. So it's a combination of that fear, right? In the being used to a particular way of working, the gatekeeping and taking our time, which no business can right now in 2020 absorb, right? Because that just comes at too big of a price on agility. And if you don't start adopting these practices, it will become eventually existential to the organizations that we're working for. And this is, again, this is not just security. This is overall on how agile. I don't like the word agile because it comes worded with the frameworks of agile, but it's about business agility, right? On how fast we can, how we can break the tensions between speed and quality, but having it in the process that we can do things at speed because the assurance of quality is built into the process and not outside of it. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, perfect.
Any other questions? Nope. Okay then, Lona, would you want to wrap up? Yeah, we have one more on chat. We will be having one more question.
All right. So, okay, we have one question here.
So the question is, do you think that the issue is also to do with the centralization of security and have a security team as a bottleneck, where perhaps it might be interesting to have security decentralized? For sure, for sure. And that is also part of what I'll be talking about next week. There are many things stacked against it, right? So professional CISOs are used to all those big budgets and having very, very big teams, when actually the new design patterns require experts that can talk the same language as the people doing the work, but leaving them with the agency and ownership of how that looks like, right? So there's going to be inertia from management because it implies potentially smaller teams and potentially less budget, and no one wants to find themselves in that position typically from a kind of exec level perspective. Yeah, and the problem is, it's not so much, it's not only as bottleneck, though that is also a problem. It's what it means to is, can the security teams actually have the knowledge to help engineer the process so it gives, on one hand, the gatekeepers the information they need and the assurances that they require for risk management, compliance purposes, whatever may be the case, but on the same hand, allow for that flexibility so we don't need to be on everyone's faces all the time because they don't know what we expect from them, right? And I think a big part of that is also why I like to talk about the next stage being, as security people need to be better at writing stories, user stories. We need to get better at defining scenarios for testing, and eventually we need to get better at writing compliance as code checks and things like that, because the way engineers and developers are used to dealing with quality is that they will have tests for performance, they're going to have potentially tests for cost, they're going to have metrics for all of these things, right? And we need to stop thinking as security as a kind of a very specialist area that you need to ask us because it depends, right? To a more quality assurance type approach, right? Part of delivering a quality product and service is to doing it securely, and how can we integrate the way we generate our security outputs into the engineering process so that it is treated as another element of quality assurance, right? And that's where we still we're not there yet. And I think there are two aspects to it, which I actually tweeted and wrote a post about it earlier today. We need to find better ways of getting the right scaffolding in place, right? Or to leverage the business scaffolding that is going to make the creation of secure products and services more likely. And that is usually quality assurance. So how does the organization approach their quality overall? And how does the organization manage business risk? So not forget about security. It's how do the decision makers make decisions under uncertainty, and do they understand what can go wrong and what they can do about it? Right? From a commercial, from a features perspective. So those are the scaffolding that when exists, it makes it easy to augment it to include security. When they don't, we are fighting an uphill battle because we don't have that scaffolding in place. I hope that makes sense. So an example of a user story could be something as simple as cookies, right? The usual example that I give. In order to, off the top of my head, if I'm going to, as a security engineer, I want to have security headers on so that I can avoid MIME spoofing, right? And for that, I'm going to use same origin on my cookies, for instance. Right? It's writing things in a way that are not on the spreadsheets, but writing it as user stories, like they get requirements from every other from every other area. Yes, we want to make security. So therein lies the challenge, and that is something that we're going to talk about when I do the double act with Manuel Paes from Team Topologies on next Monday, on applying those concepts. We need to start changing the way we approach security and considering the cognitive load. Right, a big problem with a lot of security people is that we have the expectation that everyone needs to become a security expert. Right. And that's not a reasonable expectation for lots of different reasons. One of them is on cognitive load. We sometimes have teams that are responsible for code bases in 2 or 3 languages, and we're still expecting them to know another 10 security products. It's not going to happen, right? We're human. There's an amount of cognitive load that we can deal with. So what we need to do is instead work with as much as we can, work with the product teams to develop some capabilities, then ideally try and push them to the level of platform so they can consume, like they consume other quality tests, etc., from the platform, and keep it to a minimum the level of, with things such as a threat modeling, for instance, to keep them to a minimum the level of knowledge they actually need to hold in their heads to think about security. And then everything else, we need to think how we as security professionals, as the subject matter experts, can contribute to those activities and to that knowledge at the different levels. So product, platform, and working at the level of practices, and how we can introduce the minimum level of knowledge that they require in order to improve the security of the things they're building. Right? But expecting that everyone's going to be a security professional or security expert, that's the wrong expectation, because we're not considering that people are human and they can only hold so much information in our heads. But definitely, I would say it's not so much as making it seamless, it's making it as easy as possible to consume, right? Even if you can't make it seamless, the next best thing would be to make it easy to consume. Right, and it's 4 o'clock. Thank you.